On a quiet autumn evening in the small town of Brookhaven, the Whitmore home looked like something from a postcard. Warm lights glowed through the windows. A neatly trimmed lawn framed the front yard. And from the outside, everything about the Whitmore family appeared perfectly normal. But sometimes the most ordinary homes hide the most complicated secrets. And in this case, the truth would slowly reveal a life no one saw coming. James Whitmore was known as a dependable man. He worked as a financial consultant in the city, commuting nearly an hour each morning before returning home in the evening. Neighbors described him as polite, friendly, but reserved. He waved when passing by, kept to himself, and rarely drew attention. His wife, Laura Whitmore, was almost the opposite. She was active in the local community, volunteering at charity events and organizing school activities for their two children. Together, the Whitmores appeared to have built a stable, successful life. A quiet house in a peaceful neighborhood, two growing kids, a steady career. From the outside, nothing about their lives seemed unusual. But investigators would later say that the first sign something was wrong came from something surprisingly small. It began with a routine financial review. At the firm where James worked, employees were occasionally required to submit records for internal auditing. For most employees, this was just another administrative step. But when James Whitmore's records were reviewed, one detail caught the attention of an internal compliance officer. Several business travel reimbursements didn't quite match the documented schedules. At first, it seemed like a simple clerical error. But as the officer looked closer, the inconsistencies began to grow. Dates that didn't align, trips that had no clear purpose, receipts that appeared, strangely, incomplete. The firm flagged the issue for further review. Still, no one believed it would lead anywhere serious. After all, James Whitmore had been a trusted employee for years. Yet the discrepancies continued appearing in small ways. Not dramatic enough to raise alarms, but consistent enough to create questions. Around the same time, Laura Whitmore began noticing something different at home. James had always worked long hours, but recently, his schedule seemed more unpredictable. Some evenings he arrived late without explanation. Other nights he seemed distracted, lost in thought. When she asked about it, James always had a simple answer. Just work, he would say. Busy week. Laura wanted to believe him. After all, relationships rely on trust. But small moments began to linger in her mind. Unanswered phone calls. Messages that appeared on his screen late at night. Trips that seemed longer than they should have been. At first, she ignored the feeling. Everyone has stressful weeks. Everyone gets distracted sometimes. But over time, those small moments slowly began to form a pattern. And patterns are often the first sign investigators learn to recognize. Meanwhile, the compliance officer at James's firm had quietly escalated the internal review. The financial discrepancies were now being examined more closely. And as auditors looked deeper, they noticed something else. Several of the travel records corresponded with cities where the company had no active clients. There was no clear professional reason for those trips, which raised a question that no one had considered before. If those trips weren't for work, then why had James Whitmore been there? The firm quietly documented the findings. No accusations were made. Not yet. But the questions were beginning to grow. Back at home, Laura Whitmore was also noticing small changes. James had begun guarding his phone more carefully. His travel plans were vague. Sometimes he would mention meetings that didn't seem to appear on his official schedule. Still, Laura hesitated to confront him directly. Trust can make it difficult to question the people closest to us. But as days turned into weeks, the sense that something wasn't quite right became harder to ignore. And then one evening, a small detail would change everything. James had left his laptop open on the dining table before leaving the house. Laura wasn't searching for anything in particular. She simply noticed an email notification appear on the screen. The subject line read, "Looking forward to seeing you again." Curiosity made her pause, but uncertainty made her hesitate. After all, emails can be misleading. Conversations can be misinterpreted. Still, the message stayed in her mind long after James returned home that evening. Meanwhile, investigators reviewing the financial records had reached a similar point of uncertainty. Nothing they had found proved wrongdoing, but the growing number of inconsistencies suggested something else might be happening, something hidden, and sometimes hidden details reveal much larger stories. The firm decided to continue quietly reviewing the records before taking further steps. No one yet realized how far the investigation would go, because what investigators were about to uncover would reveal something no one expected. But the biggest question still remained: what exactly had James Whitmore been hiding? As the internal review continued, the patterns surrounding James Whitmore's travel began to reveal something investigators hadn't expected. The trips weren't random, they followed a schedule, a pattern that repeated every few weeks. Different cities, but similar timelines. Each visit lasted just long enough to raise questions, but not long enough to attract attention. At first glance, it seemed like ordinary business travel. But when investigators mapped the locations together, something unusual appeared. Several cities shared a surprising connection. They were places where James Whitmore had no professional obligations, no corporate clients, no scheduled meetings. Which meant one thing: those trips were personal. Meanwhile, back in Brookhaven, Laura Whitmore's doubts were becoming harder to ignore. The late-night messages continued. James often stepped outside to take phone calls. And when she asked about his travel schedule, his answers were brief. Almost rehearsed, Laura tried to push the questions aside. But something about the situation felt increasingly difficult to explain, and eventually, the uncertainty led her to do something she had never imagined doing before. She began quietly documenting James's travel dates. At first, it felt uncomfortable, even wrong. But she told herself she only wanted reassurance. If everything was normal, the notes would confirm it. But the more she wrote down, the more the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every few weeks, James traveled to the same group of cities, and his explanations never quite matched the timing. Meanwhile, investigators had reached a similar conclusion. By comparing expense reports with travel bookings, they discovered that several hotel reservations had been paid for privately, not through company accounts, which meant those stays had been deliberately separated from official records. But why? To answer that question, investigators began reviewing additional data: phone records, email communications, public travel logs. Slowly, piece by piece, a new picture began to form. James Whitmore wasn't just traveling for work, he was maintaining a second life. In another city nearly 3 hours away, investigators discovered that James had been renting a small apartment. The lease had been signed under a shortened version of his name. But the identification used during the agreement left little doubt: it belonged to him. Inside the apartment, records showed that he had spent several nights there each month for nearly a year. Neighbors described him as quiet, friendly, but always alone. At least, that's what they believed, until investigators reviewed building security logs and discovered that James had occasionally arrived with another woman. The visits were brief, irregular, but consistent enough to raise questions. Back in Brookhaven, Laura Whitmore had begun noticing something else. James seemed increasingly distracted, more distant, and more protective of his schedule. When she asked about one upcoming trip, he explained that he needed to visit a client in another state. But when Laura checked the calendar she had been keeping, the date aligned with the same city he had visited several times before, the same city investigators were now studying. And slowly, the truth was beginning to take shape. Investigators now believed James Whitmore had carefully separated to different lives. One in Brookhaven, another somewhere else. But even they didn't yet understand the full story, because maintaining a second life requires more than travel. It requires planning, careful timing, and a willingness to protect secrets at any cost. Meanwhile, Laura faced a difficult decision. She could confront James directly, or she could continue observing quietly. In the end, she chose patience, because sometimes the truth reveals itself without confrontation. And within weeks, another discovery would confirm what investigators had already begun to suspect. The apartment lease in the other city had recently been extended. Not for a few months, but for another year. Which meant James Whitmore had never intended to stop. He had built something deliberate, something long-term. And the deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the story became. Because James Whitmore wasn't simply traveling, he was living two separate identities. Two routines, two versions of himself, one as a family man in Brookhaven, another as someone entirely different in another city. But even then, investigators still hadn't uncovered the most surprising part of the story. Because the real truth wasn't just about where James Whitmore had been going. It was about why. And the answer to that question would soon bring everything into the open. Thanks for watching. If you're intrigued by this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of this investigation. We'll see you in the next video. By the time investigators had assembled the travel records, apartment documents, and financial discrepancies, the patterns surrounding James Whitmore had become impossible to ignore. He had spent nearly a year moving between two completely separate worlds, one life centered around his family in Brookhaven, the other hidden quietly in another city. But the final piece of the investigation came from something surprisingly simple: a timeline. When investigators carefully mapped James's travel, phone activity, and apartment visits, the pattern revealed something deeper than secrecy. It revealed intention. Every movement had been carefully scheduled, work trips used as cover, private expenses separated from company records, communication kept limited and discreet. For months, the system had worked. No one had noticed. No one had questioned the routine, but secrets rarely remain hidden forever. Eventually, the growing number of financial inconsistencies forced James's employer to confront the situation directly. He was asked to explain the unusual travel patterns. At first, his answers were brief. He described the trips as client visits, additional consulting work. But when investigators presented the apartment lease, the explanation began to collapse. Because the documents showed something impossible to deny. The apartment had been rented under his identification, and the payments had been traced directly to his personal accounts. With the evidence placed clearly on the table, the story James Whitmore had carefully maintained for months began to unravel. He admitted that he had been traveling to the other city regularly. He acknowledged renting the apartment. But even then, he struggled to explain why he had kept everything hidden. For Laura Whitmore, the truth was difficult to process. Not because the investigation had revealed wrongdoing in a legal sense, but because it had revealed something else. A long pattern of deception, a life she had never known existed. For investigators, the case became less about financial records and more about understanding how such a situation had remained hidden for so long. The answer, they realized, was surprisingly simple: routine. James Whitmore had built his second life slowly, carefully, and quietly. Each trip had seemed ordinary. Each explanation had sounded reasonable, until the small details began to add up. And once investigators started looking closely, the hidden structure behind the routine became clear. The apartment, the travel, the separate accounts. All of it had been part of a carefully maintained double life. Eventually, James Whitmore left the firm where he had worked for years. The internal investigation concluded with administrative findings related to company policy violations. But beyond that, the deeper impact of the case remained personal. For Laura and the Whitmore family, the discovery marked the beginning of difficult conversations and decisions about the future. For investigators, the case became an example of how seemingly minor discrepancies can reveal much larger stories. Because the truth in this investigation had not appeared suddenly. It had been hidden within small details: a receipt that didn't match a schedule, a travel record that raised a question, a pattern that slowly emerged over time. And once those pieces were placed together, the picture became impossible to ignore. James Whitmore had been living two lives. One visible, one carefully hidden, until the truth finally surfaced. And sometimes, the most powerful lesson from an investigation isn't just about what happened. It's about how easily secrets can remain hidden in plain sight, until someone finally starts asking the right questions. If you found this story fascinating, there are many more investigations like it waiting for you on this channel. Ensure you subscribe now.